Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Nhlanhla. Great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, should government focus more on employing people than on increasing salaries and ensuring that there are fair wages? Unions are up in arms this evening following comments by the KZN Police Commissioner General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, who suggested that unions are part of the reasons the country has an unemployment crisis. So he believes that as government spending on salaries rises, the capacity to employ declines, which in his view exacerbates unemployment and crime. We speak to COSATU's Matthew Parks and Louw from the Free Market Foundation tonight. Also on the show, what is the plan to deal with blockages experienced in the courts, which lead to delays and postponements, which then result in cases taking months and even years to be resolved? The Minister of Justice, Mmamoloko Kubayi, faces the nation tonight. And then later, is BOSA going to join other smaller parties that are planning to form a coalition to contest the 2026 local government elections as one? There have been talks about smaller parties coming together and merging ahead of the 2026 elections. BOSA's leader, Mmusi Maimane, joins us. But first, my comment. So, there is unhappiness in some quarters about the comments that the KZN Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi made recently about the unemployment crisis. The unions, in fact, have told him to stay in his lane. They are unhappy with the statement that he made, suggesting that the rising unemployment rate is the result of unions constantly pushing for higher pay for their members. He made the statement during the KZN Premier's stakeholder engagement on crime prevention. Here's what he said.
We are coming from 25,000 police officers in KZN to 19,000. But the population is growing and we are going down more. Thanks to who? The unions. The labor people who said we want salaries for our employees. So the more government employment and increase salaries, is the lesser they employ. So the lesser they employ, the more crime. So we need to really interrogate and ask these things. Prima, you said this country is going down in front of our eyes. The reality is we've got too many things that are wrong in our country that contribute. Labor laws are one of those. I can tell you that. We moved to 25,000 employees. It was paying me to look at the NUMSA's Secretary General yesterday talking about the closure of Goodyear. So when you have companies that are starting to shut down, then you need to ask yourself, there are many of them shutting down in the country. The higher the salary we need, the lesser the employment. And that's a reality. We can't avoid it, but it's a fact. We must face it, it is there.
So, COSATU and of course other unions now are up in arms, and they are saying that Mkhwanazi shouldn't have in fact entered that fray. In fact, they released a statement saying that he must not scapegoat organized labor for a crisis that is rooted in government policies and structural flaws inherited from the apartheid. So the question then is, do we actually have a crisis here? Do we have a crisis of unemployment because employees are getting paid too much at the insistence of the unions? So should government then focus more on employing people than on increasing salaries? Because then what you do then is you ensure that ensures that there are fair wages. And of course, the issue of unemployment is complex, especially for a country like ours, with the history of colonialism, with the history of apartheid and the mismanagement and even corruption. So first of all, I don't think Mkhwanazi was wrong to raise this issue of unemployment if he contextualized it within the police, drawing from his observation and experience. But unions don't only exist to push for salary increases. They exist to help protect employees from exploitation, to protect workers' rights. And yes, there have been cases where unions have demanded ambitious wage increases, but they have also pushed for increases to ensure that there's fair wages. General Mkhwanazi argues that as government spending on salaries rises, the capacity to employ actually declines, which, in his view, exacerbates unemployment and crime. So he argues that our labor laws are some of what is wrong with our country. He says in the SAPS, they are now forced to rationalize resources.
And we experience it in the police, and so is everyone. Now, therefore, we have to employ other means to try and balance this. Because if we don't have a person, the means must employ a camera to help us to see at least. If we don't have a person, must employ cars so that we can have more vehicles patrolling to cover the areas that people were not normally supposed to cover. And all these things is money.
So the question we're asking you tonight is, what do you think of what the KZN Police Commissioner said? And what do you think of what the unions are saying? So do we have a crisis of unemployment because employees get paid too much, especially in the state, at the insistence of unions? And should government focus more on employing people than on increasing salaries? And what's going to happen then to the need for fair wages? You can send us a WhatsApp voice note right now on 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and your surname and where you are sending that voice note from. Alternatively, you can send us an X on @FaceTheNation SABC. Now, as I indicated, trade unions rejecting these comments by the KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner, Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, who blamed unions for the decline in the number of police officers. Mkhwanazi claimed that unions demanding wage increases negatively impact funding, making it difficult to hire more officers. He was speaking at a stakeholder engagement on crime in Durban. Let's bring in Matthew Parks now, who is the COSATU's parliamentary coordinator, and Louw, who is the founder and CEO of the Free Market Foundation. Thank you so much, Leon and Matthew, for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
Good evening.
To both of you and the viewers.
Yeah. Let me start with you, Matthew. Why do you think that General Mkhwanazi is scapegoating labor here? He could argue that he's speaking from experience as a boss in the SAPS in that province.
Good evening. Thanks for having us. So we think he's flawed for several reasons. Basically, it's tantamount to blaming a patient at a hospital for getting cancer or diabetes, or is blaming a victim of crime for being robbed by criminals. It makes no sense to blame workers for a very deep socioeconomic crisis. We're in a crisis not because of what we pay workers, which is not that much, actually quite little, including police officers. We're in a crisis because of deep structural flaws we've inherited from the party regime. We're in a crisis because Eskom was run into the ground during the decade of state capture and corruption, where electricity became unreliable, unaffordable. We're in a crisis because Transnet struggles to move our mining, our manufacturing, our agricultural goods to the markets, where huge amounts of jobs are created. We're in a crisis because Metro Rail has collapsed during COVID-19 and it transports workers to the workplace in our cities. Similarly with municipalities. And you would think that a general of the police of his seniority would also appreciate we're in a crisis because of high levels of crime and corruption. But if his economic argument, and we're not aware that he's got a background in economics, but if his economic argument is to pay workers peanuts, and that's a way to grow the economy, then the party regime would have created a very prosperous society. But it makes no sense to pay people peanuts because, number one, you'll struggle to find workers being productive if they must walk 2 hours each way to get to and from work every day. They'll be exhausted. Similarly, if workers can't afford to buy the food or medication needed to be healthy, they're not going to be productive. And we're not sure how our businesses who produce shoes, clothes, food, furniture, cars, appliances, or hotels, restaurants are going to be profitable if workers who are the majority of consumers can't afford to buy the goods. So it's a fallacious argument by the general.
Yeah.
It would have had more credibility if he said himself, as a lieutenant general of the police service, if I get his rank correctly, earns 12 times more than a constable in the police service, and he thinks a general should take a 50% salary cut. That would have credibility, but to pick upon the poor and dump the failures of politicians or the failures of the private sector, of the economy, etc., upon workers, it makes no sense at all.
Oh, yeah. Leon, what are your thoughts here? Are unions really to blame?
let's understand something very carefully here. What unions do is they represent their members, and that is perfectly in order, and they want their members to have the best conditions and the highest pay. That's their job. The regulation of wages is done by the government, not the unions. So we must blame the government for pricing labor out of the market. And it doesn't help to call it paying peanuts and all of that's nonsense. The fact is it's a simple economics 101 price mechanism. If something costs more, people buy less, and that includes labor. There is no exception to that rule. That is an absolute iron law of economics. And if you make labor cost more, the government makes labor cost more, not unions. Unions represent their members and lobby for their members. That's what they should do. And if I may say, they do a very good job, and at that they have my support. The blame falls squarely on the hands of, in the lap of the government for agreeing to having wages mandated above the market clearing rate. In other words, let's get this very, very clear indeed. What they are saying to people who are unemployed and destitute is unless you can find somebody willing to pay you more than they are willing to pay you, you have to be unemployed. A minimum wage is about the unemployed. It is a terrible thing to do to the unemployed. It's actually disgusting and disgraceful for the most destitute people in the country to say they may not find a job. It's banned, it's forbidden. Unless they can find somebody to pay them more than people are willing to pay. That is not acceptable. What we must do as decent, normal human beings is say that anyone who is unemployed is free to take whatever job they wish. They and only they should make that decision as a matter of basic human rights.
But Leon, without the unions, how do you protect workers then from exploitation in this capitalist world? I mean, you are exposing employees to exploitation.
Well, the only one who knows that is the employee. Let them decide whether they want that job or not. In the same way as when they go and buy groceries, they and only they must decide what they buy. Only they must decide what they sell, which is their labor. And the word exploitation, you see, is a kind of weasel word. It means nothing. To say that somebody is exploited, it's like saying that if you choose to pay me 100 Rand for fixing your car, I'm exploited. That's rubbish. Exploitation means nothing. What means something is the freedom to sell what you have to sell, which is your goods on the sidewalk if you're a street trader, or your labor if you're an unemployed worker. Yeah. And it is the famous British economist Joan Robinson, a socialist by the way, made the statement that the only thing worse than being exploited by a capitalist is not being exploited. In other words, destitute and unemployed. And that is cruel. That is completely unacceptable.
It is. Yeah, Matthew, let me bring you in here. I mean, you can't deny the fact that there are some companies that have let some people go because as unions, you demanded higher salary wages and some companies just simply couldn't afford that, or at least they claimed so.
We'd be very keen to know which of these companies exactly. Because the reason why companies are closing is because of structural issues. It's because electricity in the mining, the industrial sector of the economy has become so expensive and now consumes often half the budget. So that's not a wage issue. That's a problem of Eskom. That's a problem of state capture and corruption. We've seen in the mining industry thousands of jobs being lost, and not because of wages, but because of Transnet. We've seen companies closing in rural towns, like Ditsobotlo or Frankfurt. Dairies have closed. Remember the Clover case? Not because what workers get paid, but because the municipality doesn't provide basic services, paved roads, water, electricity, sanitation, which these companies require. If you go to any company, you'll find the issue there is about basic services, about electricity, it's about safety and security. It's not about what you pay workers. And it's a fallacious argument to say that unemployment is caused because workers want to earn a living wage, or the minimum wage is here. The minimum wage joined South Africa in 2019, 6 years ago. Unemployment was still sky high at that stage. You have a minimum wage in many successful industrial economies, whether it's the US or Europe in the industrialized north, or whether it's a country which is more similar to us like Brazil. And even in South Africa, it's helped to reduce the extreme levels of poverty and inequality whilst we find ways to grow the economy and so forth. But to have an economic model which says, let's pay people as little as possible and somehow we'll miraculously grow the economy. It doesn't make sense. And in fact, it's a very dangerous approach to take. You will remember about 15 years ago, we had a violent uprising in the Durrans in the Western Cape because you had farm workers who were paid so little, about R6 an hour. They could not even afford half a loaf of bread with the hour's wages.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. And to blame workers who want to earn a living wage, workers who are heavily indebted because of the structural failures of the economy, etc., and are supported by several relatives on each, it doesn't make sense. What we have to do is to grow the economy, but to grow an inclusive economy. Because again, I don't know who is going to buy the shoes, the clothes, the furniture, the food, the cars we produce, if workers who are consumers are paid so little money, they can't even afford public transport. They must walk 2 or 3 hours to get to work each way. You're not going to find a productive way to grow the economy. And if you look at successful economies, Sweden, Canada, etc., they have grown it by being inclusive, not by paying workers. It might offend some people, but the reality is workers get paid peanuts. And we will mention the case of police constables who will take home less than 10,000 rand a month. And we expect those police constables, when average each week one police officer is murdered in the line of duty, to be motivated to risk their lives. Yet they get paid so little, they are drowning in debt. They're borrowing credit money to pay for food. It's not a sound economic model at all.
But Matthew, someone may argue that sometimes as unions, you have these ambitious demands. You promise workers high salary increases and how you're going to fight for that. And then workers join the strikes, they lose income in the process, only for those high salary demands not to be met. I mean, I understand that's the risk taken, but there have been cases where the demands are just not feasible and workers actually end up paying the price. I remember how, in fact, was it in 2019 when AMCU took workers for a ride when the union led workers through a 5-month strike, if I'm not mistaken, at Sibanye Stillwater, only to suspend the union's demands and accept the offer that was long accepted by the other unions like Solidarity and the National Union of Mine Workers. And at that time, workers lost money during what was described, in fact, by some as a futile strike.
No, then we would agree with you, and I'm glad why you mentioned that National Union of Mine Workers led with a sober approach. The NUM belongs to COSATU, and I think our differences with some unions who do take workers on a dangerous populist ride is well known. So our shop stewards will be thoroughly prepared beforehand to know what a company can afford or what it can't afford. And that's why we also push through NEDLAC and through Parliament the Companies Amendment Act, which requires companies listed in the stock market, the large companies, the SOEs, to disclose to their workers, their unions, their financial reports, so that unions can know this company can afford X, it can't afford Y, let's focus on that. But it is part of the negotiated traditions by employers, by employees to say, we want 10 rand, the employer will offer you 5 rand, we'll settle at 7.5. But also if you look at the strikes, you're right, Clement, the people who pay the price for strikes as workers only go on strike as a port of last resort when the negotiations have failed, when management has refused to find them halfway, because in reality most strikes are based upon the no work, no pay principle. So when workers go on strike, it's because they're very frustrated, they're very desperate. But also it makes it difficult, Clement, because we want to see labour market stability, because it benefits workers, it benefits the businesses, benefits society, the economy, etc. But it's difficult to also to win that buy-in of workers when you would see the CEOs of mining companies that you mentioned, of banks, of insurance companies, of retail companies, earning 500,000 rand in a day, 1 million rand in a day, and that worker will be lucky to earn 100,000 rand in a year. And you find those same companies like the banks retrenching workers every year, pleading about the wage bill, but when it comes to paying themselves, they're very happy to pay themselves 50 million. Or there was even a case of 300 million in 1 year for one CEO. So I think we need to have a bit of a all-inclusive argument to say how to really make South Africa a more equitable society. Not that we're all equal 100%, it's fine, but a more inclusive and a more just society.
Leon, what's the argument then here? Are you suggesting that then government should focus more on employing people than on increasing salaries and ensuring that there are fair wages? So just employ as many people as possible, even if you're going to pay them, I don't know, 1,000 rand a month, because many people are desperate for employment. So living in a country with such high levels of unemployment, a lot of people will take whatever they want but that's at the risk of also being exploited, where, as Matthew says, a CEO can walk away with 300 million rand a year, but there's no conversation being had about how you compensate the person who's working on the ground.
Let's understand some simple economics here, please. Matthew has some idea that CEOs decide what to pay themselves. They don't. CEOs are paid by shareholders, and the biggest shareholder on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is black South Africans through the Public Investment Corporation. They decide what CEOs must be paid, not CEOs. You can be the most greedy CEO in the world, you do not get 1 cent unless the shareholders and the investors think you are worth that cent. That's what they decide what you paid, not yourself. It's got nothing to do with that at all. The other thing is, if you are a decent and caring human being, you worry about the person who is unemployed, not the employer, not the union, not the person with a job, the person without a job. And 60% of young black women, for example, are unemployed. What do they do? Now, if you have a slight hint of ethics and morality and care, then you say, those people, whoever they are, who are unemployed, let them decide, let them come first. Give them the basic human right to earn something. And the famous economist Thomas Sowell said, there is no such thing as a minimum wage. There is zero wage. All minimum wages are zero. You earn nothing. So what you want to do is to be able to say to people as a fundamental, decent human right, morals and ethics, that they are free to earn something, which is better than nothing. And to condemn them to earning nothing is just incredibly cruel and inhumane. I'm all for unions, as I say, negotiating the best for their workers with any mining company or any bank or anyone. That is their job. But it is not their job to victimize poor, destitute, unemployed people, as I say, 60 or 70% of whom are black young women are unemployed. And for us to sit here having this discussion and using words like exploitation is completely inhumane. Do we not care about these people and want them to have the fundamental human right to earn something, for them to decide to whom they sell their labor and their time, not for the three of us, or not for Mkhwanazi, or not for anyone else, certainly not for the government. This should have nothing to do with the government whatsoever. It should get out of the way and let employers and employees, including the self-employed, by the way, decide for themselves under what condition they are employed.
So, Leon, how do you then protect those employees from a selfish, let's use that term now, a selfish employer who then decides that out of 100 million rand, that the profit that the company makes, they're just going to pay 2% of that, let's use that for argument's sake, to employees, when in fact they can afford to pay 40% of that revenue or 30% of that profit to those employees. I mean, is that a free lunch now for all? Because you can't argue that there are no people out there who are employers who are selfish enough to want to take all the profits for themselves and not care about the sweat and the hard work of people that are making that money for them. How do you regulate that kind of selfish, unacceptable behavior?
By competition, Clement, it's very simple. You want them to be selfish. That's why they employ somebody, because they're selfish. That's why they do it. And that's why the worker takes the job. So what you want to do is you want to say, we want as much competition for employment as possible. In other words, we want as many people as possible seeking employees. Now, how do you do that? You have low taxes, you get rid of red tape, you free up the economy, you maximize demand for labor. That's what you want to do. And the only risk you run is if there's not enough demand for labor, and there's not enough demand for labor if you have bad economic policies, terrible policies. If you have a complete free market economy, like Sweden, for example, one of the freest economies on earth, Canada, one of the freest economies on earth, which Matthew mentioned, yes, what you want to do is you want to follow them, or more particularly, you want to follow China, which created these huge free economic zones, the freest economies on planet Earth, where there are no minimum wage laws. but the demand for labor is so high that the wages are rising and rising and rising, and the idea that China has cheap labor is no longer true. It now has some of the world's most highly paid labor, and you achieve it by increasing demand for labor. You want more people, more greedy and selfish people wanting to employ people. The more you have, the more they drive the wages up, and the higher incomes and the better the workers will be, as they are in China, increasingly in India, certainly in places like Sweden, one of the freest economies on earth. And people have some kind of weird idea that Sweden is somehow socialistic. That's just rubbish. They just haven't looked at the index of economic systems in the world, which shows it as one of the freest. And China, by the way, has the freest economies probably that have ever existed on earth. And if we want to grow at the rate of China, South Africa would now have 8 times, now listen to this number, 8 times the current GDP had we grown at the same rate as China since 1994. 8 times. In other words, we would be paying workers amongst the highest wages on the planet had we simply allowed the economy to be free and increased the demand for labor.
Okay.
That's the important thing. You want more demand, more demand. You want more greedy, selfish people wanting to get labor.
Matthew, let me give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yeah, look, I think first a couple of things, and I don't think one needs to abandon paying workers a living wage because we need to grow the economy. The two are different issues. What we need to fundamentally do is address what has been an obstacle to growing the economy. So that is about making sure we have affordable electricity, because that right now is a major problem for mining, for manufacturing. It's about making sure our freight rail, our ports are efficient or competitive or world class, because that's key to our export sectors. It's about making sure that our passenger railway network is efficient, because that's key to the urban economy and to workplace productivity in our cities. And it's about fixing municipalities. It's about dealing with crime and corruption so we can attract investors, so that we can save money from the state to invest in the networks that the businesses, that the economy and society depend upon. But I think this misplaced 18th century Charles Dickens mentality that says if you pay people peanuts, and let me say it is peanuts, we're the most unequal society in the world, and that shouldn't be a source of pride, then we can't expect things to get better. It's a fundamental economic logic. If you treat workers as your most qualified, your best asset, you'll improve productivity. And we've seen it time and again. If you look at the South African Revenue Service, they've shown you how you can fix the state. You appoint competent management, you remove corrupt elements, you fill critical vacancies, you invest in their capacity and the infrastructure of the institution. And as a consequence, you've seen SARS' productivity growing by leaps and bounds. Yeah. They spent R1 billion, yes, but the amount of additional revenue SARS was able to collect for the state to fund public services, to invest in the economy, was 60 billion rand. So we need to have a similar approach across the state, including the police service. But similarly, any sober employer who is keen on growing his workplace will know that if you treat your workers well, they'll reward you with productivity. If you treat your workers badly, you're going to struggle to achieve things. And if the issue is about affordability, then the number one place to start with is with those CEOs. Because the same CEOs cry affordability when it comes to their cashiers, their security guards, their cleaners, etc. And we're not sure how we're going to grow this economy if we have people in Manenberg who live in backyard dwellings. Their entire life will be spent in a backyard dwelling, from a grandmother to the grandchild. We're not sure in Khayelitsha how we're going to grow an economy if those residents can't afford the basic elements of life. And we're not sure how any company is going to sell its products if we pay people so little. So for us, we've got to get the basics right, and part of that is having a more inclusive economy. But I think Leon raised an important point. It is workers' pension funds who are invested throughout the stock market, in the private companies, in the retail sector, and it is time that those pension fund boards, including where workers sit, begin to hold the investment funds managers accountable, including the PIC, to say we need to start having higher standards for where we invest our monies. Yeah. And it's workers' monies, and therefore those workers should be paid a living wage, should not be paid peanuts. Yeah.
Matthew Parks, who's with COSATU, and Louw, who's with the Freedom Foundation. Thanks to both of you for joining us for this conversation. Here's a question we've been asking you this evening on Face the Nation. What do you think of these comments that were made by the KZN Police Commissioner suggesting that unions are to blame for the country's rising unemployment? Do you think that government must focus more of its time on employing more and more people as opposed to focusing on increasing wages ensuring that there are fair wages. Sidwell says he's partly correct in that the firms and international investors look at red tapes before they plow their investment in a country. Salvation says the persistence of unemployment crisis is neither caused by unions nor the higher payment of salaries, but by poor leadership crisis that we're facing as the nation. Dennis says rather than blaming unions, it's essential to address these underlying issues, such as investing in education and converting former colleges of education such as Lemana College into prisons to increase employability and reduce poverty. Lureko says, I disagree with the Lieutenant General. People must be paid for the work that they provide. Worse, low-ranking police officials are embarrassingly underpaid. So it's foolhardy for the Lieutenant General to blame the unions. And of course, part of what even the police unions have said is that you end up now, when you don't have fair wages, you end up attracting people in the police force that don't necessarily are the best of the best because you are just not paying them enough. So it's important that there are fair wages because that ensures that there can be some higher levels of productivity. Here's what some of you have said on the voice note line.
And Clement, Milford Cheney here. I think this Mkhwanazi gentleman is being a populist. He's being a populist and behaving like a capitalist. He can't be making such remarks. He must be advocating for more employment among South Africans, not this anti-employment stance. I thank you.
Sam Aleko 3 copies Dumela. Mkhwanazi is seeing things bare as they are, but he should slightly be ethical. For now, he is the mostly celebrated person. But one weak point about Mkhwanazi is that he does not know how to keep his lane. He seems to be overly overstepping his mandate. Celebrated as he is, he must choose whether to be a politician or a policeman. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. Justice and Constitutional Development Minister Mmamoloko Kubayi says there are measures in place to address the delays experienced at magistrates' court. Delays at the country's lower courts result in cases taking months and even years to be resolved. Kubayi says a department has convened a National Case Backlogs Committee to speed up access to justice. She joins us now via Zoom. Minister, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement, and good evening to your viewers.
So anyone who has visited the courts will tell you of the blockages experienced in our courts, which lead to delays and postponements that contribute to growing case backlogs in the courts. Who does this committee consist of, and how is it going to reduce these blockages? Okay,
maybe just to explain that, because I hear you saying there's backlog in terms of years. In lower courts, because we've got different types of courts, in lower courts we don't have years of backlogs in terms of the case. Where we have backlogs is in terms of superior courts. So, for example, today I was at New Brighton and I was asking them when, if a person has a case that is coming before the court, which dates are they likely to give? And they're giving dates within this year. So others, even in other matters, within 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they're starting to be heard. So in terms of case backlog management, we've got it at various levels. In the courts themselves, I've been encouraging where the court, for example, senior magistrate or the head of magistrate team is not having it to resuscitate. This will be a committee that has a magistrate, will have the National Prosecuting Authority or prosecutors that are there in that court. It will have representatives of legal aid who are operating in that court, the court manager at that level, and some of the officials within. So everybody who has a role within the value chain that has to look at issues that will delay prosecutor, for example, somebody who's leading the team that deals with interpretation, so that when there is a interpreter that can't be there, or in terms of going to leave, they should be able to schedule, including clerks and recorders that should make sure that there's recording devices in terms of infrastructure inside the court. So we have it at all levels in terms of the courts, and where it's not operation, we've encouraged that it must be at national. Then it's at the level where my DDG responsible for court operations also sit with the teams of various heads of courts representatives that are able to see all these other areas.
Do we have sufficient internal capacity, though, to support these court operations? Because we often hear of postponements because of lack of services. And I mean, it is important, this provision of services in our courts, the court administration support, even including, of course, the availability of those language services in the courts.
Look, there are various reasons why there will be delays. In other courts, for example, you'd have courts not functioning because there's no water. So when municipalities can't provide water, and where we do not have water tankers, because previously we did not assign to every court to have a water tanker. So that's where you'd have, for example, a postponement if they can't have an alternative to be able to run. Similarly with electricity, in other areas, then they will say there's no electricity, therefore postponement. But what we have started to do as the department is to be able to do alternative energy sources, for example, generators at courts, so that when there's no electricity, the generator can kick in and provide for basic services and allow for the court to run. Two, we also ensuring that now we have water tankers. In many of the courts you already have, for example, Constitutional Court will have a water tanker. Some of the magistrate courts would have a water tanker, so that when there's no water coming through from municipality, they can run. Similarly, again, in another area that we're dealing with, interpretation. One of the issues that we've raised is that in terms of, and this is an interpretation that I've said to magistrates, this is my understanding of the Constitution, because we have people who come, Clement, from various countries. They are in the country, they utilize English to operate in the country. When they go to court, then they want Portuguese interpretation. And then an interpretation of a presiding officer will be, it has to be provided, because therefore it's the language. And it will be a fair trial if the person is provided. And I'm still arguing it, but it's not something that I've been able to win. To say that in terms of the Constitution, Portuguese is not recognized as a South African language. And therefore, why must the state pay for a Portuguese interpreter? And therefore, my understanding of the language that the person can be tried in, it's a language that are recognized in terms of South African Constitution. But some of the presiding officers do insist that there must be those interpretations. And I must say, Clement, it's a high cost driver for us as a department, because we must get somebody from another side, travel to Eastern Cape, for example, or travel to Limpopo to go and interpret this language. And therefore you pay for the transport, we pay for the service, for their service, and you pay for their accommodation. So it's a lot of money that we are trying to cap in terms of postponements and all that. But again, you've got an issue of our legal aid. I must acknowledge as the minister, one of the areas that we have not been able to resource properly as the state is legal aid. And one of the areas that I said to the team I would like to look at is to see if legal aid the law can be changed, so that we allow Legal Aid Board, the Legal Aid South Africa, to have an element of commercial where they can generate income, so that as the state we utilize legal aid to run our affairs in court and pay them, and therefore that money, so that it can pay for a developmental mandate, which is South Africans who are needing the services from legal aid. Okay.
In just the last month, Minister, we've had 2 prosecutors, if I'm not mistaken, shot and 1 killed in the Eastern Cape. You were in New Brighton Magistrates Court in Gqeberha. How concerned are you about the security assessment at our courts?
Extremely concerned. Actually, in less than a year, we've had 3 prosecutors killed in Eastern Cape. In Gqeberha, we have 1. On Monday, there was an attempt on another one. Fortunately, he's been able to survive. This morning, as arrived within the area of New Brighton, one of the comrades in my political party was killed this morning. So it's a concern about the killing and crime in our country, Clement, not only for prosecutors, but for prosecutors going to New Brighton. It was a very painful sight, I must say. They raised the concerns about their safety. They said they don't want debriefing. They want me to address the issues about their safety in terms of the court, infrastructure, and areas where they are working. As you enter the court is not, and I can't lie about these things because the public knows, the court does not have sufficient security at the entrance. You can walk, literally anyone can walk to an office of a prosecutor. It's not an ideal situation. I've asked for the team to urgently deal with this matter. Clement, it's something that I have to literally make sure that attend to, because they're raising quite a number of issues that you can have anything walking into that court. Somebody can walk into that court and attack a prosecutor or even a magistrate. The offices of the magistrates are not like many of the courts. You literally walk from where you are going to a court, on the passage you can literally walk into a magistrate office, into a courtroom. And there's no security. The guys who are doing registration and taking dockets, registering dockets and all that, there isn't even a glass that protects them where the dockets are sitting. So it's an extreme concern for me. And I said to the management, they need to manage. They've got to be doing their work. It can't take a minister to visit a court to be able to identify these weaknesses and sort of. Lucky tomorrow I've got a meeting with all our senior managers across the country who will be here in Gauteng, and representatives of the province, those who are leading the provinces, will be there, and we will definitely have to have accountability from the managers. Yeah,
let me ask about the TRC cases inquiry now, because that's soon going to hold pre-hearings. My understanding is that they said that your department will decide and allocate the budget. Have they approached you with a budget? How much is this commission likely to cost?
They don't have to approach us, Clement. The procedure is that when the president announces a commission, the Department of Justice is responsible to ensuring that commissioners are, as president announced, are formally contracted. Those legal teams that are there needs to be formally contracted. A venue and all support mechanisms needs to be in place. We've been doing that for both commissions. With the TRC commission, we're estimating Hampepe commission, we're estimating around 45 million in terms of the cost. The team said it can be down or whatever, but these are estimates. So we look at venue, we look at, for example, information needs to be secured, we look at live streaming, we look at the offices, we look at the staff, we look at compensation of the commissioners, and we look at the protection of the commissioners. And if there's a need, then we look at protection of those who are testifying, which we are anticipating in the Nhlanhla Commission.
Okay, Minister, thank you so much for your time. That's the Justice Minister, Mmamoloko Kubayi. After the break, we'll have a conversation with BOSA leader, Mmusi Maimane. Stay with us. All right, so let's now bring in Mmusi Maimane, who is the leader of BOSA. The party has looked at the year now since they've been in Parliament, in the National Assembly. They've reflected on their time in the Gauteng legislature as well, but they've also reflected on the GNU and of course the claims or even plans that have been made that perhaps BOSA may be asked together with other parties to join the GNU. Mmusi Maimane is the leader of BOSA, joining us now via Zoom. Mmusi, thank you so much for making time. Good evening.
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. Thank you so much for having me.
So there are other organizations like Rise Mzansi in the GNU that are calling for a reset of this coalition. Some have called for the reconfiguration of the GNU. How do you rate this GNU a year later?
Well, first and foremost, Clement, 14 months down the line, there can be no denying the fact that South Africa faces an economic crisis. Trend lines are telling us that more people are joining the ranks of the unemployed than those finding jobs. We're growing at less than 1%. And if the budget this year is anything to go by, it tells us a story that says that there is no plan that is fundable that puts the economy on the right track so that we can budget against that. So what I would urge is that 14 months down the line, the reset isn't just whether you add new political parties or not, or you resolve the squabbles between the ANC and the DA. The plan must be that, what is the economic plan? Who are the best players you can put on the table? what reforms and spending reviews you're going to put on the table. Because if there's a crisis in this country, it is the economy. And ultimately, I'm of the complete view that the GNU can't just be solving for electing the president. The GNU must solve for what the economic crisis is going forward.
You have said that in your statement that one of the conditions you have as BOSA to join the GNU would be for, is it for parties like the EFF and the MK party to join the GNU?
No, I think what we're saying is that that's aligned on the basis of values. You can't have values that say to yourself, you are going to work with people, whether they are corrupt, whether people are anti the Constitution, and that if those values aren't ones that put citizens first ahead of political parties. South Africans want ethical leadership. They are largely citizens, as I spoke to them at the National Dialogue, who are religious, who are, they want ethics. And therefore, you can't have people within the GNU who are unethical, corrupt, have not grown an economy, and ultimately are divisive or anti-constitutionalist. So for me, I'm not here to decide which parties there are. What I'm fundamentally wanting to say is that let's establish what knocks people out, because racist, anti-constitutionalist, corrupt people should not be in the GNU. And if you are corrupt, you must be kicked out. And therefore, the future should be about saying, how do we align that to make sure the most competent, ethical are able to take the leadership going forward? Because we don't have time to simply just congregate for the sake of being in government. Now is a time about execution and delivering for South Africans.
Is there a need, though, for a signed agreement? Because the GNU still doesn't even have an agreed policy agenda as required by the statement of intent. So existing policies of the ANC are what's arguably guiding this GNU.
This is, in fact, the fundamental basis upon which we say the condition with which we join with is to say, let us work on an economic plan that then becomes the binding consensus and the agreement with which to cooperate. Because what that will do is that it will tell us what the destination is that we're trying to see South Africa in. For me, Clement, in 5 years from now, we must talk about a South Africa that's growing at over 3%. We've spoken even as BOSA to say we are going to table a plan for prosperity, and that plan presumes a number of critical aspects to which we will use that as a basis for negotiation. I'm not here to negotiate any position if the conversation begins. I'm here to say, here are the reforms. Let's cut expenditure. Let's ensure that we free up infrastructure spend. Let's ensure that we reset our geopolitics so that we attract investment in this country. And let's focus on nothing else but job creation that is on the bedrock of a skilled South African youth. That must be the mantra with which we go in at. Otherwise, in the absence of that, like I said earlier, budgeting becomes hard because you don't know what your annual performance plans are, you don't know how to measure them, and even I sit here today, when I look at ministers in the GNU, each of their parties can judge them, but how do us as citizens able to assess whether they've reached the actual goals they were supposed to reach, and what are the goals?
There have been talks about small parties coming together and merging ahead of the 2026 elections. Are you ready as BOSA to lose your identity and be part of an amalgamation of parties that will contest elections as one?
That's an important point of clarification. Well, firstly, BOSA will exist all the way till 2029 because that's what citizens voted for. What we've got to get right is answer the basic question: what vehicle do we put on the ballot that works for all citizens? Because if you've got 5 parties that have got similar values, that stand in a ward, particularly in a local government election, and let's, for ease of mathematics, each of them get 10 votes. The party that's got 12, maybe the 6th party that comes in and gets 12 votes, wins, even though if all the other ones work together, they would win that ward. So there's a strategic question that when we look at metros, how do we ensure the best candidates are under one place, one vehicle, and then in the midst of that, we could form a bloc that could dictate rescuing the metros, because local government is on the verge of collapse, and none of us live nationally. We live in a municipal, and therefore it's important that we fix municipalities.
And how would that work? Because I had thought that, okay, after the elections, then if it doesn't work, do you dissolve back to your own organizations? But as you say, BOSA will exist until 2029. I do remember what happened to the multi-party charter. I mean, that moonshot didn't really land. What happens if this one also doesn't land?
Well, I think, Clement, we can prepare for many things, but this is an important one to get right. I also do think that if there's a national dialogue to be had, we must be able to answer the question, as the ANC or the liberation movements are losing, where do those votes go? The dialogue we must also have is, what is the alternative for South Africa? What is the governance framework in the long run? So it cannot not work. It has to work, because if we want to see a vibrant democracy in this country, we need to build that alternative in the realigning of politics. So it will be the beginning in the local government election, and it will work itself out to 2029.
So it would look like the multi-party charter, what the DA and Action SA and other parties tried to do in the last election.
No, not at all. Not at all.
How different
it will
is
have
it?
One, because the multi-party charter had all the same parties on the ballot paper.
Okay.
This will be able to say, let's put one entity on the ballot paper, so that if a voter comes in, they can know the following parties are really behind this one entity, and therefore that entity is the party to vote for. So that's how it will work, and that glues it together. So what will be factually true is that all the candidates that get elected in that entity remain councillors of that entity. They are not going to become some federation in the various parties.
So you would have to come up with a new name then for this entity that houses all these political parties.
It'll be for the purpose of the election in 2026, and it's important that we show South Africans the alternative and bring about a sense of change. That's the priority.
Which parties are you in conversation with?
Well, I've always maintained that I will speak to as many different organizations as possible. At this stage, it's not only just political parties, because we're not just trying to solve for the politics. We want to engage civil society. We want to engage various faith-based communities. So it's a broader coalition of citizens. And I would urge, Clement, if you'd allow me the privilege to be able to say, let us communicate when all the respective members have come together and working, we'll be able to send you that feedback about who are the citizens that we're wanting to work with.
Have you, and then what would the vision look like after the election? So let's say there are some successes with this political party that's this entity that's housing these political parties. How do you then move forward afterwards? Do those people then work for this entity? I'm trying to determine what happens when there are successes and there are people that are elected into local government.
Well, that's a very crucial question, because what will drive it isn't just only the ethical councillors that we're wanting to put on the table, but it's also to say, what is the vision that those people are going to bring into a particular city? And part of it is about, let's make sure that city is not corrupt, the city can build infrastructure, it can ensure that the economy grows, it can ultimately ensure that basic services are delivered to people. And so when you look at those particular successes in that space, imagine, Clement, when you think about Johannesburg and you think about Tshwane and Ekurhuleni and many metros, that you've got a block of South Africans who've all agreed and signed on to that vision, not just coming from politics, because the BOSA model has always been that let's find non-politicians to come and work because they bring skills. Imagine when those people then come into councils armed with that vision. They can advocate for it and make sure that we turn local government around, which is the principal focus of what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm excited about it, because you will see even people who are not perhaps maybe in any political party stand in wards, stand in communities to say, I am here to put up my hand for my city so that my city is a different place. That is for me very exciting.
All right, Mmusi Maimane, all the best with that. Thank you for speaking to us. That's the leader of BOSA. How different is this entity going to be from the multi-party charter that the Action SA, together with the DA and other parties, tried in the previous elections? Thank you for watching the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday at 8 p.m. Have a good evening. Cheers.